March 15, 1944. Hauptmann Karl Brenner emptied his entire ammunition load into a single American P-47 Thunderbolt over the Rhine Valley, 273 rounds of 20mm cannon fire, and over 1,800 machine gun bullets, yet watched in disbelief as the massive fighter continued flying, trailing smoke and oil but refusing to fall from the sky. The German ace would later write in his combat log that he had witnessed something impossible, a violation of every principle he understood about aerial combat and aircraft destruction. What Brenner didn't yet know was that this single encounter would force the entire Luftwaffe Fighter Command to fundamentally reconsider their assessment of American engineering and the strange, barrel-shaped fighter they had initially dismissed as too heavy, too slow, and too vulnerable to survive the European air war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun broke through scattered clouds over occupied France, casting long shadows across the countryside 22,000 feet below. First Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the sky through the armored glass of his P-47D Thunderbolt's cockpit. The instrument panel vibrated with the steady thrum of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of American industrial might, turning a four-bladed propeller that measured over 12 feet in diameter. Hartwell flew as element leader in the 352nd Fighter Group's mission to escort Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, returning from a bombing run against ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. 48 Thunderbolts formed a protective umbrella above and around the bomber formation, their distinctive bulbous fuselages unmistakable against the pale morning sky. The radio crackled with routine check-ins. Everything seemed routine. Then the lead pilot's voice cut through the static, sharp and urgent. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming down fast." Hartwell's eyes snapped upward. 24, Fokker-Wulf 4 190 seconds dove from 28,000 feet, sunlight glinting off their wings as they plummeted toward the American formation. The German fighters had positioned themselves perfectly above, behind the sun, with altitude and speed advantage. Classic Luftwaffe tactics refined over 4 years of aerial warfare. The engagement erupted in seconds. Foe 190 seconds screamed through the American formation at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky in deadly geometric patterns. Hartwell rolled his Thunderbolt hard right, pulling 6 Gs as he turned to engage a German fighter that had overshot its attack run. The Foe W-190 pilot recognized his error immediately and tried to extend away from the fight, using his superior roll rate to escape. But Hartwell had 2,000 horsepower at his disposal, and the P-47's turbo supercharger was feeding his engine compressed air that gave him power at altitude that the German pilot couldn't match. He closed the distance, centered the TW 190 inches his gun sight, and pressed the trigger. 8. 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously. 4 in each wing, staggered to prevent jamming, fed by 425 rounds per gun. The combined rate of fire exceeded 100 rounds per second. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds walked across the TW-190's fuselage. The German fighter disintegrated, pieces tumbling earthward trailing black smoke. Hartwell had no time to confirm the kill. Another FW-190 latched onto his tail, cannon fire already reaching toward his aircraft. He pushed the stick forward and dove, trading altitude for speed. The P-47 accelerated rapidly, its massive weight that seemed like such a disadvantage in level flight became an asset in a dive. The airspeed indicator climbed past 450 miles per hour, past 500. The control surfaces stiffened as shock waves formed over the wings, but the Thunderbolt held together where lighter aircraft would have broken apart. The German pilot followed, determined not to lose his advantage. But at 550 miles per hour, the Fokker W-190's controls locked up completely, a phenomenon German pilots called Mach-Tuck. The American aircraft pulled away effortlessly, its heavy construction and carefully designed wings, allowing it to maintain controllability at speeds that made other fighters unmanageable. Hartwell hauled back on the stick at 8,000 feet, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The Thunderbolt's wings groaned but held. He came around in a climbing turn and found himself behind a Messerschmitt Bf 109G that was pursuing another P-47. He fired a short burst. The 109 pilot never saw what hit him. 20 miles to the south, another pilot was learning the same lesson about American fighters. Lieutenant Franz Schilling had 47 confirmed victories. He considered himself expert at exploiting the weaknesses of heavy fighters he had destroyed, 9 RAF Beaufighters and 5 Bristol Blenheims, by attacking from angles where their defensive armament couldn't reach. The P-47 appeared to be another heavy fighter, just marginally more maneuverable than a twin-engine aircraft. This assessment would nearly cost Schilling his life. He positioned his Bf 109G6 for a classic beam attack, approaching from the side where he could fire without exposing himself to extended pursuit. His target was a P-47 escorting bombers at 24,000 feet. Schilling closed to 400 yards and opened fire with his hub-mounted 20mm cannon and cowl-mounted 13mm machine guns. Hits sparkled across the P-47's wing root and fuselage. Schilling saw pieces fly off the American fighter. A good burst. The P-47 should be going down. Instead, it turned toward him. The maneuver shocked Schilling. Heavy fighters didn't turn into attacks, they maintained straight flight and relied on defensive armament or tried to extend away using their superior speed in a straight line. But this P-47 was turning hard, and Schilling suddenly found himself looking not at a fleeing target, but at 8 50 caliber machine guns pointing directly at his cockpit. He broke hard left, his 109's lighter weight allowing him to outturn the American fighter. But as he completed his break and looked back, the P-47 was still there, still turning, its pilot using combat flap settings that dramatically reduced his turn radius. Schilling's advantage in maneuverability wasn't as overwhelming as he had assumed. The American pilot fired. Tracers reached toward Schilling's aircraft but passed harmlessly behind. The German pilot had more experience, better deflection shooting skills. He would use his superior training to compensate for his diminished aircraft advantage. The two fighters circled each other for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. Neither pilot could gain a decisive advantage. The 109 could turn slightly tighter, but the P-47 could maintain its energy state better, using its powerful engine to avoid bleeding speed in the turns. Schilling tried to climb away, using the 109's superior climb rate. The P-47 followed, its turbo supercharger maintaining power at altitude. Eventually, Schilling disengaged and dove for the deck, using his lower weight to accelerate more quickly in the initial moments of the dive. The P-47 followed but couldn't close the gap before Schilling reached the relative safety of German-controlled airspace at treetop level. Both pilots returned to base intact, but profoundly changed in their understanding of what they faced. That evening, Schilling filed his combat report. He noted that the P-47 was far more capable than intelligence assessments suggested. It could absorb significant damage and continue fighting. Its pilot had been aggressive and skilled. The American fighter was not the easy target that Luftwaffe tacticians had predicted. Similar reports flooded into Luftwaffe headquarters from across the European theatre. German pilots who had initially viewed the P-47 with contempt were revising their opinions based on harsh combat experience. The dismissive nickname they had given it, Der Kübel, the bucket, mocking its ungainly appearance, was being replaced by more respectful terms. Some pilots were calling it Der Panzer, the tank, acknowledging its incredible ability to absorb battle damage. The initial German assessment of the P-47 had been shaped by preconceptions about what made an effective fighter aircraft. Since the Spanish Civil War, Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized agility, rate of climb, and maneuverability above all other characteristics. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 embodied these principles: lightweight, nimble, excellent at dogfighting. When German pilots encountered heavier aircraft like the RAF's Westland Whirlwind twin-engine fighter, They found them easy prey precisely because they lacked the agility to survive close-in combat. The P-47 appeared to violate every principle of successful fighter design. It weighed 13,400 pounds, loaded for combat nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109G. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the loaded weight of most single-engine fighters. The massive radial engine and its associated ducting, intercooler systems, and turbo supercharger made the aircraft look like a flying barrel. German intelligence photographs showed an aircraft that seemed designed by engineers who didn't understand the fundamentals of air combat. Oberst Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, one of Germany's most experienced fighter leaders, first saw P-47 photographs at Jagdgeschwader 77 headquarters in Sicily in early 1943. His initial reaction was dismissive. "The Americans have built a bomber escort that looks like a beer keg," he told his staff officers. "It might be useful for long-range patrol work, but our 109 seconds and 190 seconds will slaughter it in a dogfight." This assessment was shared across Luftwaffe Fighter Command. Major Heinz Baer, already credited with over 150 victories, reviewed the P-47's specifications and concluded it would perform similarly to the RAF's Hawker Typhoon, powerful in a straight line, hopeless in a turning fight. The prevailing wisdom suggested that German fighters should engage the P-47 using the same tactics that had proven effective against other heavy fighters. Attack from angles where the American aircraft's limited maneuverability prevented effective response, maintain the initiative through superior agility, and exploit the P-47's poor climb rate by using vertical maneuvers. These tactical recommendations were distributed to Luftwaffe fighter units throughout the European theatre in the spring of 1943. German pilots prepared to face the new American fighter with confidence. They had years of combat experience, their aircraft were proven. The Americans were flying an overweight, underpowered monstrosity that would be easy prey for skilled Luftwaffe aces. The first large-scale engagement between P-47 seconds and Luftwaffe fighters occurred on April 15, 1943, during an escort mission over the Dutch coast. 36 Thunderbolts from the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups protected B-17 seconds bombing German airfields. 24 W-190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader, 26 intercepted the formation at 27,000 feet. The German pilots attacked with supreme confidence. They dove through the P-47 formation, made single firing passes, then climbed back to altitude for another attack. Standard tactics against heavy fighters, but the P-47 seconds didn't respond like heavy fighters. Instead of maintaining formation and trying to ward off attackers with defensive fire, they broke formation and engaged aggressively. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, leading the German formation, found himself pursuing a P-47 that had broken away from the escort screen. He closed to firing range and triggered a burst from his 20mm cannons. Hits registered along the P-47's fuselage and left wing. Pieces of aluminum skin flew off. The American fighter should have been critically damaged. Instead, it rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S, diving away at tremendous speed. Priller followed, but his followed 190 couldn't match the P-47's acceleration in the dive. The American aircraft pulled away, its heavier weight allowing it to reach speeds that made pursuit impossible. Priller pulled out at 15,000 feet and looked for another target. He spotted a P-47 engaged with one of his wingmen. The American pilot was fighting defensively, turning hard to deny the German a clean shot. Priller maneuvered to set up a high-side attack that would trap the P-47 between two German fighters. As he rolled into his attack run, tracer fire suddenly flashed past his canopy. Another P-47 had positioned itself above Priller's flight path and was firing at him. The American fighters were working in coordinated pairs, covering each other like veteran combat pilots. This was not the behavior of inexperienced pilots flying inferior aircraft. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the Germans had shot down 2 P-47 seconds, but lost 3 40 W-190 seconds, with 2 more heavily damaged. The loss ratio was not favorable. More concerning were the combat reports German pilots filed after landing. The P-47 was fast, especially in a dive. It could absorb tremendous battle damage. Its firepower was devastating, and its pilots were using sophisticated tactics that suggested excellent training. Major Gerhard Schöpfel, Gruppenkommandeur of 2, JG-26, reviewed the combat reports with growing concern. He had expected his experienced pilots to achieve overwhelming victory against the new American fighters. Instead, they had barely achieved parity. He immediately sent a message to Luftwaffe Fighter Command, requesting updated tactical guidance for engaging P-47 seconds. The response came back within 48 hours. Jagdwaffe headquarters acknowledged the P-47's capabilities, but emphasized that German pilots still maintained advantages in agility and climb rate. The recommended tactics were refined. Engage at medium altitude where the P-47's turbo-supercharger advantage was minimized. Avoid prolonged turning engagements where the American fighter's energy retention gave it staying power. Use hit-and-run attacks rather than sustained combat. Most critically, never try to outdive a P-47. Its terminal velocity exceeded anything German fighters could safely achieve. These revised tactics represented a fundamental shift in German thinking. The Luftwaffe had spent years perfecting dogfighting techniques that relied on superior maneuverability. Now they were being told to avoid dogfights with a fighter they had initially dismissed as too clumsy to survive air combat. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. May 1943, over Bremen, Germany. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer led 32 Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds against a formation of B-17 seconds, escorted by 48 P-47 seconds. Meyer had developed the head-on attack as a technique for defeating American bombers' approach from 12 o'clock high, fire from maximum range, pass through the formation before defensive guns could track effectively. He decided to try the same technique against the P-47 escorts. Meyer positioned his formation 5,000 feet above the Americans and slightly ahead. At his signal, the German fighters rolled inverted and pulled through into near-vertical dives, building tremendous speed. They would flash through the P-47 formation at closure rates exceeding 800 miles per hour, fire at point-blank range, and be passed before the Americans could react. The attack began perfectly. German fighters screamed down through the formation, cannons and machine guns hammering away. Several P-47 seconds took hits. One began trailing smoke, but as Meyer pulled out of his dive and looked back, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The P-47 seconds hadn't scattered. They hadn't fled. Instead, they had turned directly into the attack, meeting the German fighters head-on with their own guns blazing. 8. 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft created a wall of lead that the diving German fighters had to fly through. The American pilots weren't flinching. They were attacking their attackers. 2 Bf 109 seconds exploded mid-dive, their pilots unable to take evasive action at such high speed. A FAF 190 pulled out with its entire left wing shredded by 50 caliber fire. Meyer himself felt his aircraft shudder as rounds hammered into his tail section. Only his speed saved him. He was through the formation and climbing away before the damage could register. The head-on attack had always worked against bombers because bomber pilots had to maintain formation. Fighter pilots could maneuver. But Meyer had assumed the P-47 pilots would maneuver away from the attack, not into it. This American willingness to engage head-on changed everything. It meant German pilots couldn't rely on speed and shock alone. They had to be prepared for the Americans to fight back aggressively, even when surprise and altitude advantage should have given Germany every tactical benefit. These early engagements established patterns that would define P-47 operations throughout the war. German pilots learned to respect the Thunderbolts' capabilities while still believing they could exploit specific weaknesses. The P-47 couldn't climb as well as a 109 or turn as tightly as a 190, but it could dive like nothing else in the sky, absorb astounding amounts of damage, and hit back with devastating firepower. The real revelation for German pilots came not in dogfights, but in damaged aircraft that somehow made it home. June 26, 1943. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was escorting bombers back from a raid when 190 bounced his formation. In the initial attack, Johnson's P-47 took catastrophic damage. 20mm cannon shells tore through the rear fuselage, destroying the radio and puncturing the fuel tanks. Machine gun fire shattered his canopy, peppering Johnson with glass fragments. His oxygen system failed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. Johnson dove for cloud cover, trailing fuel and smoke, but before he could reach safety, an FW-190 latched onto his tail. For the next 5 minutes, Oberleutnant Egon Meyer systematically destroyed Johnson's aircraft. He fired burst after burst, walking his shots across the P-47's wings, fuselage and tail. Johnson counted the hits over 200 bullet strikes and more than 20mm cannon impacts. His rudder was shot away. The left elevator was nearly destroyed. Holes big enough to crawl through punctured the fuselage. The cockpit armor stopped most rounds from reaching Johnson directly, but the aircraft itself was being torn apart. Meyer pulled alongside several times, clearly puzzled why the American aircraft was still flying. He even shook his head in visible disbelief at one point before positioning for another attack run. Finally, after expending all his ammunition, Meyer saluted Johnson and flew away, apparently convinced the American would never make it home anyway. Johnson's P-47 was barely controllable. The fuel situation was critical. Leaking tanks meant he was losing precious gallons every minute. The engine was running rough, damaged by multiple strikes. But it was still running. The massive R2800 radial engine had taken several 20mm hits directly into the cylinder heads, yet continued producing power. Johnson flew the crippled Thunderbolt across the English Channel at treetop level, unable to climb because of the damage, unable to bail out because his canopy was jammed shut. He made it back to his base at Manston and executed a wheels-down landing despite partial hydraulic failure. When he finally climbed out, ground crews counted 200 bullet holes and 21 cannon shell impacts. The aircraft was a flying wreck, yet it had brought Johnson home alive. This incident sent shockwaves through both American and German commands when the details became known. For American pilots, it became legendary proof of the P-47's incredible survivability. For German pilots who heard the story, it was a sobering lesson. Egon Meyer had done everything right, tactically caught an isolated enemy fighter, achieved firing position, and delivered devastating aimed fire. Yet the American aircraft had survived. The P-47's ability to absorb damage stemmed from fundamental design decisions made years earlier, long before German pilots would test those decisions in combat. The story began in 1940, when the United States Army Air Corps recognized that European air combat had evolved beyond anything American designers had anticipated. Current American fighters, the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra, were already obsolete by European standards. Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at Republic Aviation, proposed a radical solution: build the fighter around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the output of engines powering existing American fighters. But harnessing that power would require a massive airframe. Kartveli embraced this requirement rather than fighting it. The design that emerged was unlike anything in American or European service. The fuselage was enormous, necessary to house the turbo supercharger system that gave the engine full power at high altitude. The cockpit was positioned far forward, giving the pilot excellent visibility. Behind the pilot sat nearly 200 gallons of self-sealing fuel tanks, protected by armor plate. The engine was surrounded by robust cowling that could withstand significant battle damage. Everything was built heavier than conventional wisdom suggested a fighter should be. This fundamental heaviness proved to be the P-47's greatest asset. When German cannon shells struck the aircraft, they encountered robust structure that absorbed and distributed the impact energy. The R-2800 engine had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. Destroying 3 or 4 cylinders still left 14 functioning. The air-cooled design meant no vulnerable coolant system that could be punctured, causing catastrophic engine failure. The self-sealing fuel tanks worked exactly as designed, closing around punctures before massive fuel loss occurred. German pilots accustomed to fighting Spitfires and Hurricanes with liquid-cooled engines found the P-47's survivability incomprehensible. In a Spitfire, a single 20 mm round through the coolant system meant engine failure within minutes. The pilot had to land immediately or bail out. But P-47 seconds took multiple engine hits and kept flying because their radial engines didn't depend on coolant circulation. The wing structure was equally robust. The P-47's wings were thick by fighter standards, housing the main fuel tanks and ammunition bays. German pilots who achieved hits on P-47 wings often saw spectacular results, fuel streaming out, pieces breaking off, yet the wing continued to provide lift and structural support. The main wing spar was massively overbuilt, capable of handling stress loads far beyond what normal combat maneuvers would impose. This over-engineering violated conventional aircraft design philosophy that emphasized minimum weight. Every pound of structure was a pound that couldn't be fuel, ammunition, or engine power. But in the specific context of long-range bomber escort, the extra weight proved worthwhile. A lighter fighter that couldn't survive the mission to bring its pilot home was worthless, no matter how agile it might be in a dogfight. Throughout the summer and fall of 1943, German pilots accumulated hard-won experience fighting P-47 seconds. The learning curve was steep and expensive. Every engagement refined German understanding of what tactics worked and which ones were suicidal. Never engage head-on became a universal rule. The P-47's 8.50 caliber guns created a cone of fire that could saw a Bf 109 inches half. German fighters mounting 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns had less total firepower, and their weapons were spread across nose and wing routes, reducing concentration. In a head-on engagement, both pilots were likely to score hits, but the American pilot was much more likely to achieve kills. Avoid extended dives became equally important. German pilots who tried to escape by diving away found themselves rapidly overtaken by P-47 seconds that could safely reach speeds beyond 550 miles per hour. Several Luftwaffe fighters broke apart in attempted escape dives when they exceeded their structural limits, trying to maintain separation from pursuing Thunderbolts. These restrictions fundamentally altered German tactical options. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine had always emphasized aggressive engagement using speed and altitude advantage. Now German pilots were being told to avoid entire categories of combat maneuvers because the P-47's design made them too dangerous. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots were still winning individual engagements. Their aircraft still maintained advantages in specific performance parameters. But the overall picture showed American air power growing stronger while Luftwaffe capabilities plateaued and then declined. By early 1944, the P-47 had become the most numerous American fighter in Europe. Over 1,000 Thunderbolts operated from British bases, flying daily escort missions deep into Germany. Luftwaffe Fighter Command faced a strategic dilemma. They needed to destroy American bombers to prevent the systematic destruction of German industry, but doing so required breaking through P-47 escort screens. Every bomber raid meant inevitable combat with Thunderbolts, and those combats were steadily depleting Germany's fighter strength. The loss ratios told the story. In the first 6 months of P-47 operations, Luftwaffe fighters achieved rough parity, roughly 1 German aircraft lost for every American fighter destroyed. But as American pilots gained experience and German losses mounted, the ratios shifted. By mid-1944, P-47 seconds were achieving 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 kill ratios. German training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots fast enough. Fuel shortages limited training flight time, meaning replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal preparation. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning to exploit every advantage their aircraft offered. They developed combat techniques that maximized the P-47's strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. Finger 4 formations replaced older three-plane elements, giving American pilots better mutual support. Dive and zoom tactics utilized the P-47's superior high-speed performance. Most importantly, American pilots learned to fight as teams, covering each other and maintaining energy advantage, rather than getting drawn into slow-speed turning fights where German aircraft held advantages. The P-47's reputation for bringing pilots home alive became a crucial morale factor. American pilots trusted their aircraft to protect them when everything went wrong. German pilots increasingly felt they were fighting an enemy who could absorb their best attacks and still survive. This psychological dynamic mattered enormously in the grinding attrition warfare that characterized the air campaign over Europe in 1944. The winter of 1944 brought Germany's most desperate gamble. The Ardennes offensive, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16th, with the goal of splitting Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. For the operation to succeed, the Luftwaffe needed to achieve temporary air superiority, giving German ground forces freedom to maneuver without constant aerial attack. On the morning of December 17th, Oberleutnant Heinrich Rosenberg led his staffel of 8 Bf 109 G-14 seconds toward the front lines near Monschau, Belgium. Their mission was simple: destroy American fighter bombers that were savaging German armored columns. Intelligence reported that P-47 Thunderbolts from the 365th Fighter Group were operating in the area, attacking anything that moved on the roads below. Rosenberg spotted them at 8,000 feet, 12 Thunderbolts in finger 4 formations, circling above a German convoy. Even from 3 miles away, he could see the results of their work. Vehicles burned along the road. Explosions rippled through the column as 500-pound bombs found their targets. The Americans were methodically destroying everything. He positioned his formation above the Americans at 12,000 feet, using a thin cloud layer for concealment. The plan was straightforward: dive through the P-47 formation, make a single high-speed firing pass, then extend away before the Americans could react. Classic hit-and-run tactics designed to minimize exposure to the Thunderbolt's deadly defensive firepower. At Rosenberg's signal, the 8 Bf 109 seconds rolled inverted and pulled through into steep dives. They accelerated rapidly, building speed that would carry them through the engagement zone in seconds. Rosenberg selected his target, a P-47 at the rear of the formation, slightly separated from its wingman. An easy kill. He centered the Thunderbolt in his Rev-C 12D gun sight and pressed both triggers. The 20mm MG-151/20 cannon and twin 13mm MG-131 machine guns roared, sending a stream of explosive shells and armor-piercing rounds toward the American fighter. Rosenberg saw strikes along the P-47's fuselage and left wing. Good hits. The American aircraft should be critically damaged. But instead of trailing smoke and dropping out of formation, the P-47 rolled hard right and pulled into a climbing turn directly toward the diving German fighters. The pilot was counterattacking immediately, giving Rosenberg no time for a follow-up shot. The Bf 109 flashed past at over 450 miles per hour, and Rosenberg continued his dive to build separation. Behind him, the entire P-47 formation had reacted with stunning speed. Instead of scattering defensively, they split into 2 sections. One element maintained position over the German convoy, continuing their ground attack mission. The other section's 6 Thunderbolts turned to engage Rosenberg's fighters. What followed was a brutal 10-minute engagement that exemplified everything German pilots had learned to fear about P-47 combat. Rosenberg's pilots had altitude and speed advantage initially, but the Americans refused to fight on German terms. When the Bf 109 seconds climbed back to altitude for another attack run, the P-47 seconds climbed with them, using their turbo-supercharged engines to maintain position. When German pilots tried to extend away using superior acceleration, the Thunderbolts pursued relentlessly, their heavier weight allowing them to maintain speed in level flight. Rosenberg found himself in a turning fight with a P-47 flown by Captain James Kunkel. The American pilot was using every trick the Thunderbolt offered: combat flaps to tighten his turn radius, careful energy management to avoid bleeding speed, and aggressive use of vertical maneuvers to prevent Rosenberg from gaining a firing position. Every time Rosenberg thought he had an advantage, Kunkel countered with a maneuver that forced the German pilot to reset his attack. Finally, Rosenberg committed to a climbing spiral, trying to use his Bf-109's superior power-to-weight ratio. The two fighters corkscrewed upward, each pilot pulling maximum Gs in the thinning air above 18,000 feet. Rosenberg's 109 should have been able to outclimb the heavier P-47, but Kunkel's turbo supercharger gave him full power at altitude while Rosenberg's engine was gasping for oxygen. At 22,000 feet, Kunkel's guns found their mark. A 3-second burst stitched across Rosenberg's left wing, punching through the thin aluminum skin and severing control cables. The Bf-109 snap-rolled violently. Rosenberg fought the controls, barely managing to recover before entering a flat spin. He dove for cloud cover, his aircraft shuddering from the damage. When he emerged below the clouds at 6,000 feet, the sky was empty of German fighters. He scanned desperately for his wingmen but saw only 2 parachutes descending toward German lines. The Americans had shot down at least 2 of his pilots, possibly more. Rosenberg nursed his damaged fighter back toward his base at Rhine-Main, reflecting bitterly on how the engagement had gone wrong. That evening, over schnapps in the pilot's mess, the survivors discussed what had happened. One pilot noted that he had scored multiple hits on a P-47, seeing pieces fly off the American's wing, yet the aircraft had continued fighting. Another described watching his 20mm cannon shells explode against a Thunderbolt's fuselage without apparent effect. The American had simply rolled away and engaged another German fighter as if nothing had happened. The conversation eventually turned to a question that was becoming increasingly common in Luftwaffe fighter units. How do you destroy something that refuses to die? The answer lay in the fundamental engineering philosophy that had guided the P-47's design. While German aircraft emphasized performance optimization, extracting maximum speed, climb rate, and agility from minimum weight, American designers had prioritized different values: survivability, range, firepower, and maintainability. Republic Aviation's production facilities in Farmingdale, New York, turned out P-47 seconds using mass production techniques borrowed from the American automotive industry. Each aircraft was built with generous tolerances and robust components that could withstand both combat damage and rough handling by ground crews. The electrical system was duplicated if one generator failed. The aircraft could operate on the backup. The hydraulic system included emergency hand pumps that allowed pilots to lower landing gear and flaps even after complete system failure. Most significantly, the P-47 was designed for rapid field repair. Damaged panels could be replaced in hours rather than days. Engine changes required only basic tools and could be accomplished by moderately trained mechanics. This maintainability meant that P-47 seconds that might have been written off as total losses in other air forces were returned to combat status within 48 hours. German pilots witnessed this production capacity firsthand during attacks on American airfields. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied air bases in Belgium and Holland. Over 900 German fighters struck at dawn, catching the Americans completely off guard. At the Y-34 airfield near Metz, 190 strafed rows of parked P-47 seconds. Pilots from Jagdgeschwader 2 made repeated passes, destroying or damaging dozens of Thunderbolts. Explosions rippled across the tarmac. Fuel tanks erupted in fireballs. It appeared to be a devastating victory, the kind of tactical success that might buy Germany precious time. But within 3 days, Y-34 was operating at near full capacity again. New P-47 seconds arrived from depot-level maintenance facilities in England. Damaged aircraft that could be repaired were cannibalized for parts to restore other fighters. The Americans' industrial capacity meant they could absorb losses that would have crippled German units for weeks. A captured German pilot, brought to Y-34 after being shot down, witnessed the rapid recovery. When an American officer showed him the new P-47 seconds lined up on the flight line, the German's cocky demeanor evaporated. "Das ist, wasn's schlecht," he muttered. "That is what is beating us. Not superior aircraft or better pilots, but inexhaustible industrial production that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them." This strategic reality shaped every tactical engagement. German pilots knew that even when they achieved local victories, shooting down 2 or 3 American fighters, in a single combat those losses would be replaced within days. Meanwhile, every German aircraft lost, every experienced pilot killed, represented an irreplaceable reduction in the Luftwaffe's combat capability. The psychological burden of fighting an enemy with such vast resources weighed heavily on German pilots. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a 22-year-old with 11 victories, described the experience in a letter to his family in February, 1945. "We shoot them down, and more come. We damage them beyond what should be survivable, and they fly home. We fight well, and still we are losing. The Americans have built a machine that we cannot break, and they have so many that we cannot win." Fischer would be killed 2 weeks later, shot down by P-47 seconds during a bomber interception mission over Cologne. His letter survived, found among his personal effects by American occupation forces after the war. As the air war entered its final phase in early 1945, German tactical doctrine for engaging P-47 seconds had evolved into a defensive posture that acknowledged American superiority. The guidelines distributed to fighter units in March 1945 were startlingly different from the confident assessments of 1943. Engage only when absolutely necessary to protect ground forces or intercept bombers. Avoid prolonged combat, make a single attack pass, and disengage immediately. Never allow P-47 seconds to force you into a turning fight. Use clouds and terrain to break contact. If damaged, do not attempt to outrun pursuing Thunderbolts in level flight dive to ground level and use ground clutter to escape. These were the tactics of a defeated force, focused on survival rather than victory. German pilots who had once attacked aggressively now found themselves on the defensive, trying to avoid engagement with American fighters that they could no longer defeat consistently. The final months of the European War produced some of the most dramatic examples of P-47 survivability. On March 19, 1945, Lieutenant Michael Boudreau of the 371st Fighter Group was attacking a German ammunition train near Frankfurt when his P-47 took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell. The projectile struck the right wing between the fuselage and the main landing gear, tearing away nearly 3 feet of the wing structure. The impact sent Boudreau's Thunderbolt into a violent snap roll. He fought the controls, expecting the aircraft to disintegrate at any moment. The asymmetric lift should have made level flight impossible. But somehow, the massive airframe held together. Boudreau discovered that by trimming the aircraft carefully and applying constant opposite aileron pressure, he could maintain relatively stable flight. He faced an agonizing decision: bail out over German territory, where he would likely be captured or killed by vengeful civilians, or attempt to fly his crippled fighter back to Allied lines. The nearest friendly airfield was 75 miles away. Boudreau chose to fly. The journey took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of constant muscle strain, maintaining control. 40 minutes of listening to the airframe groan and creak. 40 minutes of expecting the wing to fail completely and send him tumbling earthward. But the P-47 held together. The massive wing spar, designed with redundant structural elements, continued to carry loads even with significant damage. The self-sealing fuel tanks, despite being punctured by shrapnel, had closed around the holes and prevented catastrophic fuel loss. Boudreau made it to an emergency airstrip at Nancy, France. His landing approach was unconventional. He had to maintain higher than normal speed to keep adequate lift from the damaged wing, which meant a longer landing roll. He touched down hard, blew both main tires, and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. Ground crews who examined the aircraft were stunned it had flown at all, let alone for 75 miles. The 88mm shell had destroyed the main wing spar, severed all hydraulic lines on the right side, and damaged the aileron control system. By conventional engineering analysis, the aircraft should not have been controllable, yet Boudreau had brought it home. Stories like this spread rapidly through both American and German units. For American pilots, they reinforced absolute trust in their aircraft. For Germans, they became increasingly demoralizing evidence that even their most effective weapons couldn't reliably stop American fighters. German fighter ace Major Heinz Baer encountered this reality personally on April 3, 1945. Leading a formation of 4 190d9 seconds, the latest long-nose variant with improved high-altitude performance, he intercepted P-47 seconds, escorting bombers over Berlin. Baer, credited with over 220 victories, was one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled pilots. He achieved perfect firing position on a Thunderbolt, closing to 200 yards before opening fire. His 420mm cannons struck the P-47 with devastating accuracy. Baer saw large pieces separate from the American aircraft parts of the tail section, sections of the right wing, chunks of the fuselage. It was the kind of damage that should have resulted in immediate catastrophic structural failure. The P-47 rolled inverted, trailing smoke. Baer was already looking for his next target, confident the American was finished. Then, impossibly, the Thunderbolt rolled upright and began a controlled descent toward cloud cover. The pilot was maintaining control, despite damage that appeared fatal. Baer pursued, determined to finish what he had started. He fired another burst, scoring additional hits on the already damaged aircraft. Still, the P-47 flew. Baer emptied his remaining ammunition into the American fighter, watching his 20mm shells explode across its fuselage and wings. When his guns clicked empty, the Thunderbolt was still airborne, still under control, still heading toward friendly territory. In his post-war memoir, Baer wrote that this engagement fundamentally changed his understanding of American PLOS, air power. He had always believed that German pilots, with their superior training and combat experience, could compensate for material disadvantages. But watching that P-47 absorb his entire ammunition load and continue flying made him realize that some material advantages were simply too large to overcome through skill alone. The final accounting of P-47 operations in Europe told a story of overwhelming success. From April 1943 through May 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts flew over 546,000 combat sorties. They were credited with destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other American fighter type in the European theater. But their most significant contribution was in ground attack missions, where they destroyed or damaged over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The loss rate was remarkably low. Only 0.7% of sorties resulted in aircraft losses, half the rate of P-51 Mustangs. This statistic reflected both the P-47's incredible durability and the confidence it gave pilots to press home attacks. P-47 pilots knew they could absorb damage and survive, which made them more aggressive in ground attack roles where exposure to anti-aircraft fire was unavoidable. German veterans who survived the war and later encountered P-47 seconds at aviation museums or airshows consistently expressed profound respect for the aircraft. Johannes Steinhoff, who had shot down 176 Allied aircraft, including 4 P-47 seconds, visited the National Museum of the United States Air Force in 1989. He spent nearly an hour examining the museum's Thunderbolt, studying the gun installation, the massive engine, the robust wing structure. When asked by a museum docent what impressed him most about the aircraft, Steinhoff replied, "Everything." The Americans understood something we did not, that survivability matters more than perfection. We built beautiful aircraft optimized for performance. They built ugly aircraft optimized for winning. There is a lesson in that. Franz Stiegler, another Luftwaffe ace who later immigrated to Canada, wrote extensively about P-47 encounters in his memoirs. He noted that German pilots developed enormous respect for the Thunderbolt, referring to it by the nickname Der Eisern, the Iron One, rather than the earlier derisive terms. Stiegler wrote that the P-47 represented a fundamental difference in design philosophy. German aircraft were built like racing cars, optimized for peak performance. American aircraft were built like trucks, designed to survive harsh conditions and keep operating regardless of damage. This philosophical difference extended beyond aircraft design to entire military doctrines. German forces emphasized qualitative superiority, better training, better tactics, better equipment at the individual level. American forces emphasized quantitative superiority, backed by industrial capacity, good equipment produced in overwhelming numbers, maintained by robust logistics, and supported by training programs that could replace losses rapidly. The P-47 embodied this American approach perfectly. It wasn't the fastest fighter, or the most agile, or the best climbing, but it was fast enough, agile enough, and capable of climbing adequately for its mission. More importantly, it was reliable, maintainable, and nearly indestructible. These qualities mattered more in a long war than peak performance characteristics. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Training programs had collapsed. The few German fighters that still flew faced overwhelming odds every time they took off. On April 25th, one of the final air combats over Germany occurred near Leipzig. 6. Bf 109 K4 seconds. The ultimate production variant of the venerable Messerschmitt fighter intercepted a formation of P-47 seconds, attacking a German airfield. The Bf 109 K was the fastest, most powerful conversion ever built, capable of 452 miles per hour at altitude, and armed with a devastating 30mm Mk, 108 cannon firing through the propeller hub. The 6 German pilots were veterans, survivors of years of combat. They should have had every advantage against the Americans, but when the engagement ended 5 minutes later, 3 Bf 109 seconds had been shot down, and the remaining 3 were fleeing at full throttle, pursued by Thunderbolts that wouldn't break off. The German pilots managed to escape only by scattering into different valleys, forcing the Americans to choose which targets to pursue. This engagement, buried in the vast records of hundreds of thousands of combat missions, exemplified everything that had changed since 1943. German pilots flying their best aircraft with their finest remaining pilots still couldn't achieve victory against American fighters that they had once dismissed as inferior. The lesson was complete. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, thousands of P-47 seconds were still operational in Europe. Many would be scrapped in the years immediately following the war, victims of peacetime budget constraints and the arrival of jet aircraft. But the Thunderbolt's legacy was secure. It had proven that unconventional design approaches could succeed when they addressed real operational requirements rather than theoretical performance parameters. The German pilots, who had learned to respect the P-47 through bitter experience, carried those lessons forward. Many became commercial pilots after the war, flying airliners that prioritized reliability and safety over performance. Some became engineers, designing new aircraft with an appreciation for robust construction and survivability. Their war experiences had taught them that the most important characteristic of any aircraft was the ability to complete its mission and bring its crew home alive. In the decades after the war, aviation historians would debate endlessly about which was the best fighter of world. War II. The Spitfire had grace and agility, the Mustang had range and speed, the TW-190 had firepower and handling. But pilots who had flown combat missions consistently ranked the P-47 at the top of their list. not because it excelled in any single performance category, but because it kept them alive. The statistical evidence supported their judgment. P-47 pilots had the highest survival rate of any American fighter pilots in Europe. More P-47 pilots completed their required combat tour of 25 missions than any other fighter type. When asked years later why they trusted the Thunderbolt, veterans gave variations of the same answer: because it brought them home when nothing else could have. The P-47's story ultimately transcended aviation history to become a case study in engineering philosophy and strategic thinking. The aircraft succeeded because its designers understood that perfect performance in isolated parameters mattered less than adequate performance across all mission requirements, combined with exceptional survivability and maintainability. This insight influenced American military aircraft design for generations. The F-4 Phantom II of the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds followed similar design principles: heavy, powerful, not particularly agile, but robust and capable of multiple mission types. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, named explicitly in honor of the P-47, took the concept even further, designing an entire aircraft around a massive gun and making it so tough that it could survive direct hits from anti-aircraft artillery and continue flying. But perhaps the P-47's most important legacy was psychological. It demonstrated to an entire generation of American engineers and military planners that unconventional solutions could succeed if they addressed real problems rather than conforming to conventional wisdom. The willingness to build a fighter that weighed twice as much as its contemporaries, that looked ungainly and violated aesthetic principles, but that worked superbly. Well, in combat, this willingness to prioritize function over form became a defining characteristic of American military technology. German pilots who had dismissed the P-47 1943 based on photographs and specifications learned through devastating combat experience that their assumptions were wrong. The flying beer keg they had mocked turned out to be one of the most formidable weapons of the war. By the time they truly understood what they faced, it was too late to change the outcome. The final irony was that Germany had possessed all the technical knowledge necessary to build aircraft like the P-47. German engineers understood turbo supercharging, robust construction, and systems redundancy, but they were constrained by doctrinal assumptions that prioritized dogfighting performance above all else, and by resource limitations that made heavy construction seem wasteful. They optimized for what they believed mattered most, and discovered too late that they had optimized for the wrong things. American designers, freed from doctrinal constraints and supported by enormous industrial capacity, built what the mission required rather than what tradition suggested. The result was an aircraft that German pilots learned to fear and respect, that accomplished its mission with devastating effectiveness, and that brought its pilots home alive, even when subjected to damage that should have been fatal. That was the lesson German aces learned about the P-47 Thunderbolt. Never assume that conventional wisdom is correct. Never underestimate an enemy who approaches problems from different assumptions. And never dismiss an aircraft based on specifications alone, because combat reveals truths that equations cannot predict. By the time the Luftwaffe's best pilots fully appreciated these lessons, the sky over Germany belonged to the Americans, and the war was lost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.